Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's very nice to see you all here today. So I won't keep you very long. I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes talking you through some of the key findings that emerged from our study looking at the effects of economic recession on stress within families, parenting and children's adjustment. Okay, so as we all know, Ireland was hit by an economic recession beginning, I suppose, around the year 2008. And this provided what we might call an unfortunate experiment in nature, because it gave us the opportunity to track what happens when a recession hits. And it gave us an opportunity to look at the effect of the recession on a large representative sample of families and their children in Ireland. Now, there's been a very long history of research on the effects of socioeconomic disadvantage on children's development. And I suppose the broad conclusion that can be drawn from this research is that generally children, or on average, children who grow up in a context of disadvantage fare significantly less well on a range of developmental outcomes. So things like their social, emotional, cognitive development, they tend to do less well in school, they tend to have poorer health on the whole. Now, in comparison with this research, there's really limited research that looks at the direct effects of a recession on children's outcomes at a population level. And I suppose when a recession hits, it can affect different groups who have heretofore been not being characterised as being socio-economically disadvantaged. So we see that there perhaps is a greater diversity of families who may be affected by an economic recession. And there are a number of different things that happen in a country when a recession hits. So it may be that the instability and change in the economic status of a family can contribute to instability and chaos within the home setting. Investments that parents and families can make in their children tend to occur more intermittently. So when parents have to have fewer financial resources available to them, they have to reduce consumption, and they may reduce the financial investments that they make, for example, in children's education, or they may have to cut back in the kind of activities in which they enroll their children, and so on. And these are quite common responses to economic shocks. So just the idea of sort of cutting back on what might be considered as sort of luxuries within the family. And then I suppose from a broader perspective, we see that the reduction in fiscal resources available to governments might affect service delivery across a range of areas that are pertinent to children's development and lives. So things like the education, early childcare settings, the health system, and so on. So as I said, the timing of the data collection between waves 1 and 2 for our infant or the 08 cohort of growing up in Ireland really coincided with the onset of this Great Recession. Now, I think in the analysis and in the report, we kind of wanted to go beyond just sort of understanding how something like economic hardship might affect children's development. And we wanted to really examine or try and uncover some of the pathways or the ways in which economic hardship might impact upon development, because as you can imagine, a 3-year-old is broadly not aware nor doesn't care what's going on in terms of the broader economic status of the country. So how is it then that these children might be affected by something like an economic recession? So our research was very much framed by the family stress model. Now, the family stress model was developed by researchers in rural Iowa in the United States, and it was developed in the 1980s in order to understand the impact that the downturn in the agricultural economy, which was dominant in that area, had on families at that time. And they developed this family stress model as a sort of way of seeking to understand the pathways by which economic recession may trickle down to affect the lives of children and children's emotional, behavioural and cognitive outcomes and their physical well-being. So as you can see from the diagram, the model basically says that we start off with certain economic events or economic shocks, such as might happen during a recession. For example, having a high level of indebtedness, income being reduced, negative financial events such as redundancy on the part of one or both parents. And the idea is that these negative events give rise to economic strain, or what is termed here family economic pressure. Now, I sort of think about this as the sort of psychological meaning that's associated with these negative financial events, or these this sort of economic hardship. So not all negative financial events will affect everybody in the same way. Some people may be more resilient to it. Some people may have better coping mechanisms. But the key thing is the sort of psychological impact, if you like, of these negative financial events. So the idea is that these events may lead to higher levels of economic strain or pressure, and this is going to affect parental mental well-being. So, for example, we might expect to see higher levels of depressive symptoms or symptoms of anxiety among these parents. We also expect that these events may sort of spill over and affect the quality of the couple relationship in households. So we can see the arrow going from parent emotional and behavioural problems to interparental conflict or low warmth and support. And I suppose the idea is that when things are not going well for parents as individuals or within a couple, the idea is that these sort of negatively spill over to affect the quality of interactions that parents have with their children. So they may have fewer sort of emotional resources to invest in their children. They may be tired or irritable or withdrawn. We may see higher levels of hostile interactions, less warmth and sensitivity in how parents interact with their children. And we know from all of the literature on parenting that when parents engage in nurturant and involved parenting, then this leads to better adjusted children. So when parenting is compromised as a result of parents struggling in their own way, then we expect that this will have a negative effect on children's emotional and behavioural outcomes. So this is basically what the family stress model is saying, and it's, I suppose, really highlighting some pathways through which economic hardship may trickle down to affect the lives of children. And the key concept really that we're interested in is this idea of family economic pressure, or we've called it strain within the report. And as I said, this gives psychological meaning to the stressful experience of economic hardship. Now, I very briefly mention this because Dorothy, I think, has covered this very well. And this, so we worked with the 08, or the infant cohort of the Growing Up in Ireland data, which was initially drawn from a random sample. A random sample was drawn, from the Child Benefit Register of the population of just over 73,000 children. We can see the map shows that the families are very well distributed across Ireland, and that the sample really very closely represents a sort of a random sample of families. Over the first wave of Growing Up in Ireland, then we can see that the timing of the different data collection waves, obviously here we're talking about the 9 months and the 3-year-old waves, so we were looking overall at a sample of about 9,800 families. And Aisling will, when she talks about the five-year report, she's obviously incorporating data from this third wave of data collection, so looking at about 9,000 families overall. And really good retention rates across the different waves. And then, as Dorothy mentioned, the children are really now about 10 years of age, and they have been studied again at age 7 and at age 9 years. But for the purpose of what we're talking about here, we're really just focusing on waves 1 and 2. Okay, so the first, I suppose, thing that we did in our analysis was really try to explore this experience of economic strain within the household. So as I said, this is the stressful experience associated with economic hardship. And this was measured in the same way that Conger and his colleagues measured it when they initially applied the family stress model. And it was basically this idea of how parents, the difficulty that they experience in making ends meet. So the sense that of struggle that parents were having. And this question was asked specifically of the mothers. And basically we found that 61% of families were experiencing difficulty in making ends meet. And this was a significant increase over the previous wave of data collection, where 44% of families were experiencing economic strain. We also found that 14% of the families were in arrears on their utility bills and 9% in arrears on their rent or mortgage. And 65% of the families had experienced a drop in income. And as we might expect, a change in income was very important for experiences of economic strain. So this graph shows the families who found themselves in a lower income quintile at wave 2 versus wave 1, in the same income quintile and in the higher income quintile, okay? And looks at how experiences of strain, change in strain between wave 1 and wave 2 related to whether or not they were in the lower, the same or a higher income quintile. And I suppose the key point here is, if we look at families who found themselves in a lower income quintile, we can see substantially more of them were experiencing more strain at wave 2, and this is not unexpected. But we also see that families who remained in the same income quintile, or even some families who went into a higher income quintile between wave 1 and 2, that a not an insignificant proportion of those families also experienced more economic strain. So I suppose the point is that income is an important determinant of economic strain, but it's certainly not the only factor, because across all three groups, even those who did experience an increase in income, about a third of them experienced higher levels of economic strain. When we looked at the other predictors of economic strain, I think some interesting findings emerged. Now, there was the four kind of strongest predictors of strain were having to cut back on basics, having to cut back on luxuries, and of course what a luxury represents is going to vary quite a lot from one sort of family to another. And not surprisingly, being in arrears on rent or mortgage and arrears on utility bills, they were among the strongest predictors of economic strain. Other things that predicted strain was where either parent was made redundant, being in a single parent household, having a lower level of maternal education, having working hours reduced and social welfare reduced. What was also interesting was when we accounted for all of these various factors, that a wage reduction per se was not associated with economic strain. So it's something beyond just the level of disposable income available to you. And we know, of course, that working and being involved in the working world confers important sort of psychological benefits for individuals. So becoming redundant is not just about the loss of income, it's also about the loss of one's identity as an employee and so on. That can also be important. So having looked at the sort of the way in which economic factors affect economic strain, the next thing that we did was we began to look at how these experiences of economic strain may be associated with the sort of parents' mental well-being. And in particular, we looked at depression, or we looked at symptoms of depression. So obviously we didn't do a full sort of clinical workup in terms of depression. We used a well-standardized measure of depression, and parents who scored above the cutoff were sort of classified as having high levels of symptoms of depression. We also measured mothers' and fathers' reports on the quality of the interparental relationship. So we hypothesized that high levels of economic strain would be positively associated with parental depression, and that parental depression would be negatively associated with marital satisfaction. So where parents experienced high levels of depression, their marital satisfaction we proposed would be lower. Looking here at the sort of just the bivariate relationship between economic strain and both mothers' and fathers' levels of depression, I suppose there's a couple of different things going on in the graph here. If we look at the bars on the far right, as you look at it, we can see that overall about 10% of the mothers were classified as sort of being in this depressive category, and this contrasts quite strongly with about 5%, 4.5% of the fathers. And we know from other research that females tend to experience higher levels of internalizing difficulties such as depression in comparison with males, and this has been borne out here. And across the board, you can see that the blue bars tend to be higher than the red bars, again pointing to this important difference between mothers and fathers. I think the other key trend in the graph is that we see that as levels of economic strain are higher, we see that the proportion of mothers at risk of depression also tends to be higher. So very significantly, where families are experiencing high levels of economic strain, so there's great difficulty in making ends meet, over a quarter of the mothers were classified as depressed in comparison with the sort of overall total of 10.6% in the population. So I think the key message here is that economic strain represents a really significant risk factor in terms of parents' levels of depressive symptoms. But other things were also important. So having to cut back on basic necessities, being in arrears on the kind of rent or on the mortgage or on the utility bills, these were also directly associated with parents' levels of depression. And I suppose being in arrears, I guess it really represents a very high level of indebtedness in one's life. You know, if you can't afford to pay for these things, and I guess it sort of is compromising one's role as an adult, and as a parent, where there are certain expectations of certain roles to fulfill, and so it's not surprising that these high levels of indebtedness are associated with high levels of depression. Now, economic strain wasn't measured directly for fathers, but we could see that certain economic events, like being in arrears on the utility bills, the redundancy of either parent was associated with higher depressive symptoms for fathers, having social welfare reduced and not being able to afford luxury. So these all emerged as significant predictors of fathers' depressive symptoms. Looking then at marital satisfaction, we see that economic strain and depressive symptoms were the strongest predictors of mothers' marital satisfaction, and also that older mothers had lower marital satisfaction, but satisfaction tended to be higher when a new baby was born between waves of the study. And perhaps this is why a new baby had been born in between waves of the study, because things were going so well in the interparental relationship. Now, for fathers, the only economic variable that was associated with marital satisfaction was, quite interestingly, having working hours reduced. So when fathers had their working hours reduced, this tended to be associated with a decrease in their marital satisfaction. So I don't know, is it that fathers are being forced to spend more time at home, and perhaps this generates sort of conflict within the family, particularly if the father doesn't want to be there or would prefer to be at work. So the father's depressive symptoms were also associated with marital satisfaction. Older fathers also had lower marital satisfaction, where fathers who had more children and where a new child had been born between waves of the study had higher levels of marital satisfaction. So of course it's not only economic factors that are affecting things like marital satisfaction, other aspects of the family context are also important. Okay, so just moving on to the sort of final steps of the model. As I said earlier, the kind of key hypothesis within the family stress model is that really what's happening within the parent's own world is likely to spill over and affect the quality of the parent-child interactions that occur. And we see, when we just compare the depressed and non-depressed mothers and fathers, we can see that there are small differences in terms of the warmth that they use when they're interacting with their children, but bigger differences when we consider aspects of hostility in terms of parent-child interaction. So this might be something like a parent, being very irritable, with their 3-year-old, or not maybe having as much patience as is typically required when dealing with 3-year-olds. And we see similar patterns in terms of parents who are classified as having sort of poorer interparental relationships. Again, less warmth and more hostility in terms of how the parents interact with their children. So I think the conclusion that can be drawn is that parental depression and marital dissatisfaction does have a negative effect, or they do have a negative effect in terms of the quality of parent-child interactions. And I guess the question is, how or does this matter in terms of children's outcomes? And it does seem a little bit premature to talk about children's outcomes when really the children are only 3 years of age, and of course there's still so much growing and developing to occur. But to take a snapshot of what might be happening for these children, or the different sort of developmental pathways that these children may find themselves on at this stage, I think is a worthwhile exercise. So we looked at adjustment difficulties in terms of both externalizing and internalizing behaviours. Now, externalizing behaviours refers to kind of acting out behaviours, so things like, having high levels of temper tantrums, sort of acting out anger, aggressive behaviours, those kind of things, not being able to sort of focus attention and so on. Now, we found some positive associations, which means that when these things were higher, children were displaying higher levels of externalizing difficulties. So perhaps not surprisingly, high levels of both mother and father hostility were associated with higher levels of externalizing difficulties for parents. Maternal depression was also associated with higher levels of externalizing difficulties. Being a recent migrant appeared to be associated with more difficulties for the children. And interestingly, although I think this finding has emerged within the broader literature, parents who have, or mothers who have higher levels of education tend to rate their children as having higher levels of externalizing difficulties. Now, negative associations, so again, the more warm mothers were, or the older mothers were, then this was associated with lower levels of externalizing difficulties. So having an older mother might represent a protective factor in terms of externalizing difficulties, and obviously where mothers are warm and nurturing, then this is a good thing in terms of their development. And then I suppose interestingly, non-significant associations between the father's level of warmth, mother's marital satisfaction, father's depression, father's marital satisfaction, and child gender. So when we control for everything in the model, none of these variables at the end here were significantly associated with children's levels of externalizing difficulties. I mean, I guess one conclusion that we might tentatively draw here is that maybe what's going on for the fathers has less of a direct impact in terms of children's behaviour difficulties, and it may be that mothers are maybe doing a better job of protecting children from that than fathers are able to do when it is the mothers who are experiencing, for example, high levels of depression. And of course, this is not to say that fathers don't matter in terms of their children's development, and we already see that father hostility is positively associated with externalizing difficulties. We also looked at internalizing difficulties, so these are really difficulties that children have in terms of their emotional regulation and their interactions with others. And I suppose I've put them on the same slides to enable us to do some sort of a comparison between the factors that matter in terms of acting out behaviours and the factors that might matter in terms of those internalizing difficulties. So we can see some differences in terms of the key predictors, but also some similarities. So again, mother hostility, mother depression, positively associated with internalizing difficulties. Being a recent migrant, this seems to represent a particularly vulnerable group. Again, the higher levels of maternal education. And having a new child born between waves, this seems to be associated with higher levels of internalizing difficulties for the children. And it may be that the children, these young children, are experiencing difficulty in sort of assimilating the new baby into the family. Maybe it is that their nose is a little bit out of joint. So I suppose it remains to be seen whether this remains as a significant predictor of internalizing difficulties. In terms of negative associations, again, mother warmth was significant, as was mother age. So older mothers and warmer mothers, their children had fewer internalizing difficulties. And here, mother satisfaction was significant, so where it wasn't previously. So higher levels of satisfaction in the interparental relationship from the mother's point of view are associated with the lower levels of internalizing difficulties. And then finally, again, the non-significant associations really involving father variables here. So unlike for the externalizing problems or like for the externalizing problems, a lot of the father variables weren't significant. So father warmth, hostility, depression, marital satisfaction, and child gender at this point in the children's development weren't directly significantly associated with internalizing difficulties. Okay, so what can we conclude from all of this? Perhaps not surprisingly, strain is highest when families are in arrears and have to cut back on their basic necessities. And as I said, this can, these are circumstances that reflect high levels of indebtedness and can be extremely stressful for parents. Really important associations between family pressure, economic strain, and psychological distress, and also marital dissatisfaction. Okay, and I mean, we haven't even gone into this here, but for children growing up in contexts where there are high levels of marital conflict and sort of dissatisfaction in the marital relationship, this conflict in and of itself can have a very negative effect on children. Of course, questions remain about the stability of these difficulties over time. Will the effect of the recession, as we've seen working its way down through to parenting and children's development, will it have lasting effects over time? Or will the economic recovery be associated with an amelioration or a dissipation of these difficulties? And I suppose the key message is that parental mental well-being really plays a key role in bridging that link between what's going on in the broader sort of macro level economic environment and circumstances and children's relationships and outcomes. And I think this sort of spillover effect, which has been well documented in the literature, really points to the importance of supporting parents who are experiencing psychological distress. And as Anne-Marie has already highlighted, I think this represents one of the key sort of goals of the new early years strategy. So that's of course to be welcomed. Okay, I think I will leave it there. Thank you very much for your attention.